The creepy legend that turned out to be real. There are places in America that carry a darkness with them, a weight that people feel the moment they step foot near them. Towns where locals whisper warnings, where stories are told to scare children into obedience, yet deep down, those same children know the stories were not just to frighten them, they were to protect them. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On the edge of a quiet town in Pennsylvania stood an abandoned farmhouse that no one dared approach after sunset. The house sat along a narrow dirt road, hidden behind rows of tall skeletal trees that looked almost like they were trying to conceal it. The wooden boards were weathered and gray, with the roof sagging inward and broken shutters hanging by rusted hinges. To anyone passing by, it was just another decaying building in the countryside, but for the people who lived nearby, it was known as the house that should never be entered. The legend had been whispered for decades. People spoke of screams that carried through the woods at night, of lantern lights flickering in the upper windows, even though the place had no electricity. Travelers claimed to see a figure standing motionless at the end of the road, a silhouette with no face, before it suddenly vanished. The story went further, darker, telling of a family who once lived there, a family that had mysteriously vanished one cold November night. No one could ever explain what happened, but when authorities entered the farmhouse, they said the dinner table was set as if the family had been about to eat. The food was untouched, and the chairs were neatly tucked in. It was as though the people had simply stood up, walked out into the woods, and never returned. For years, nobody dared to touch the property. Nature reclaimed the land, vines crept up the siding, and the windows were clouded with grime. But the legend lived on. High school students dared each other to walk up the road on Halloween, and some swore they heard footsteps following them even when no one was behind them. Others spoke of whispers drifting through the night air, soft and urgent, urging them to turn back before it was too late. It was late October when three friends from town decided they were going to prove the stories were nothing more than exaggerated tales. The evening had turned colder than expected, and the wind carried with it the smell of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. The group parked their car along the edge of the old road and began walking toward the house with only their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, unnervingly quiet, as if the entire forest was listening. When the farmhouse came into view, one of them muttered that it felt wrong to be there. The others laughed nervously, insisting it was just an old house, nothing more. But as they drew closer, the temperature dropped sharply and their breath came out in white clouds. They noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, creaking gently with each gust of wind. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and rot. Their footsteps echoed on the warped floorboards as dust swirled in the beam of their flashlights. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and in the kitchen, the old dining table still stood, covered in a thick layer of dust. Plates and silverware were still neatly arranged, as if waiting for a meal that never came. One of the friends reached out and touched the back of a chair, only to pull his hand back quickly. The wood felt strangely warm, as though someone had just been sitting there. They laughed nervously again, trying to convince themselves it was just their imagination, but unease had already set in. In the silence, they thought they heard something upstairs. A slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep on the old boards above them. They froze, holding their breath, staring at one another with wide eyes. One whispered that it was probably just the house settling, but deep down, none of them believed that. Against their better judgment, they climbed the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, and each movement felt like it echoed far too loudly. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors that hung crooked on their frames. They pushed one open and found a bedroom. The bed still made, though the sheets were yellowed with age. A child's toy sat on the dresser, its once bright paint faded, and as one of them shined a light on it, the toy suddenly tipped over on its own. The sound of it hitting the wood made all of them jump back in fear. Another creak echoed from the far end of the hallway, and this time, it was unmistakable. Someone was walking. Slow, heavy steps, drawing closer. The air grew colder with every second. So cold their fingers ached as they gripped their flashlights tighter. One of them whispered they should leave, but when they turned to head back, the staircase was no longer visible. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretched into darkness that hadn't been there moments earlier. Panic set in. They began moving quickly, trying door after door, but each room looked the same. A bed, a dresser, peeling wallpaper. It was as if the house was rearranging itself around them, refusing to let them out. Then came the sound that made their blood run cold. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but a soft whisper, calling their names. The voice was distorted, almost gurgling like it came from underwater. And it wasn't just one voice, but several, overlapping, whispering in unison. Their flashlights flickered, plunging them into brief pockets of darkness. In those moments, they swore they saw shadows moving across the walls, figures just out of reach, taller than any human should be. One of them screamed, pointing at the end of the hall. Standing there was a figure, tall and thin, its face nothing more than a pale blur. It tilted its head unnaturally far to the side, and the whispers grew louder, rushing into their ears until they could barely think. They ran, bursting into room after room, trying desperately to find the staircase again, but the layout made no sense. Doors led to dead ends, and windows that should have opened to the outside revealed only more darkness, like an endless void pressing against the glass. Then, without warning, they found themselves back in the kitchen. The table stood there, just as before, but this time the plates were no longer empty. Each one was filled with rotting, mold-covered food. The chairs were pulled out, as though someone had just been sitting there waiting for them to arrive. One of the friends collapsed in terror, sobbing uncontrollably, while the others pulled at the front door. At first, it wouldn't budge, as if the house itself was holding it shut. Then, with a violent crack, it burst open, and they stumbled out into the freezing night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, hearts pounding, lungs burning, unable to shake the feeling that something was still following them. When they finally made it back to town, they were pale and trembling, barely able to explain what had happened. They swore they would never return, and in the days that followed, each of them suffered strange disturbances. Footsteps in their homes at night, whispers in their ears when no one was there, and dreams of the faceless figure watching them from the shadow. Years later, people still avoid the farmhouse. The story of those three friends only added to the legend, fueling the warnings that locals passed down. Some say the house is a trap, built not to shelter a family, but to lure the living inside and keep them there forever. Others claim the family that vanished never truly left, that their restless spirits still wander the halls, whispering for company in the endless dark. What makes the legend truly terrifying is that it has never faded. New reports surface every so often. A hiker who got too close to the road swore he saw a lantern light flickering in the upstairs window. A driver passing by late at night claimed a figure stepped into the road and then disappeared into thin air. Some say if you stand outside the farmhouse at midnight, you can hear the sound of chairs scraping across the wooden floor, and if you don't leave immediately, you'll never walk out again. The farmhouse still stands, decaying but undefeated, as if time itself refuses to touch it. And the legend remains alive, not just a tale to scare children, but a reminder that some places carry with them a darkness that cannot be explained. A darkness that does not let go. The creepy legend turned out to be real, and anyone who doubts it only needs to step onto that lonely dirt road at night. If they listen closely, they'll hear the whispers waiting for them, calling them by name, ready to welcome them into the house that never lets go. The case that made detectives quit? In a quiet part of Pennsylvania, tucked between old highways and stretches of forest that seemed to go on forever, there was a case so disturbing that it pushed seasoned detectives to walk away. Men and women who had seen the worst of what people could do to each other, who had carried bodies out of rivers and basements, who had stared into the blank eyes of killers and lived with the weight of unsolved files, found themselves unable to stay on this one. It wasn't because of politics or money or red tape. It was because of what they saw, what they heard, and what they could never explain. It started on a cold morning in late autumn when the air was heavy with fog and the trees stood bare, their branches like black veins against the gray sky. The call came into the county sheriff's office at 6:43 a.m. A hiker had found something strange in the woods behind an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The farmhouse itself was a relic, boarded up decades ago, its roof sagging, its porch collapsing into weeds. Locals called it cursed, though no one could ever agree on why. Some said it had belonged to a family who vanished. Others claimed it was once the site of rituals. Whatever the truth was, people avoided it. Except this hiker who had cut through the property to reach a creek and stumbled across what he thought at first was an animal carcass. By the time deputies arrived, it was clear it wasn't an animal. It was a person, or at least what was left of one. The body was found propped against the back wall of the farmhouse, seated upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there. The face was gone, not missing in the way an animal might eat flesh, but peeled away, as though someone had taken it off deliberately. The rest of the skin was marked with strange carvings, deep enough to scar bone. The initials of towns that were hours apart, symbols no one recognized. And the chest had been cut open, the rib cage pried apart, and inside, nothing. The organs were gone. Detectives who first took the case thought it might have been some kind of cult killing, ritualistic, brutal, something designed to terrify. But as they combed the area, they realized this wasn't the first. Deeper into the woods, less than a mile from the farmhouse, they found another. The same positioning, the same carvings, the same hollow chest. 2 victims, arranged like mannequins in the middle of nowhere. By afternoon, the entire property was taped off. Investigators in heavy jackets moved slowly, taking photographs, bagging evidence, whispering in tones that betrayed how uneasy they were. The smell was overwhelming, not just of death, but of something sour, chemical, almost metallic. Forensics couldn't place it. It clung to their clothes, their hair, even their cars after they left the site. One officer said it reminded him of copper pipes left to rot in the rain. Another said it smelled like blood boiled in acid. The victims were not immediately identified, their fingerprints weren't in the system, dental records came back with no matches. They were ghosts, as though they had appeared in those woods just to die. But when autopsies were performed, more disturbing details surfaced. The cuts on the body were precise, surgical, almost professional. Whoever did this had knowledge, steady hands, and time. But there was something else. Something no one wanted to admit. The bones showed signs of being burned. Not the flesh, just the bones inside the body, as if the fire had started within, leaving the skin untouched. One pathologist swore the marrow had been cooked into powder. When the first photographs of the victims made their way to the station, several officers turned pale, some couldn't finish their shift. These were men and women who had seen car crashes, shootings, suicides. But this was different. It didn't look like a murder for revenge, or money, or passion. It looked like something done for a purpose no one could comprehend. Something cold, something patient. The case stretched on for weeks. Detectives followed leads that went nowhere. A drifter was brought in, questioned for days, then released when nothing stuck. A group of self-proclaimed occultists in the next county were investigated, but their rituals turned out to be little more than candlelit chanting. The town grew tense, rumors spread faster than facts, parents kept their kids home from school, hunters refused to enter the woods. Everyone seemed to know someone who had seen something, a figure moving at night, strange lights near the farmhouse, whispers carried on the wind. Most of it was dismissed, until deputies themselves began to report things. One night, while canvassing the property, 2 deputies swore they saw a man standing at the edge of the tree line. Tall, motionless, watching. They called out, drew their weapons, and advanced. But when they reached the spot, the ground was soft with mud. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there. The deputies were shaken enough to refuse night patrols afterward. Another detective reported hearing voices on her police radio. Not static, not interference, but actual voices, whispering, saying her name. The tech team tested the radio, found nothing wrong, and told her she was tired. But she knew what she heard. The next week, she resigned. The farmhouse itself became the center of obsession. Investigators searched every inch, pulling up floorboards, tearing through walls, shining lights into the cellar. They found old cans of food, rusted tools, rotting furniture, but nothing that explained the killings, except for one thing. In the attic, carved into the wood, were the same symbols that had been cut into the victims. Faded, but unmistakable. No one could determine how long they had been there. Some said decades. Others swore they looked fresh. The more they dug, the more the case seemed to unravel them. Detectives who had once prided themselves on rational thinking began to argue, lose sleep, drink heavily. One officer stopped showing up entirely, later telling friends he couldn't be near the evidence room anymore. He said every time he walked past it, he felt like someone inside was breathing. Another quit after waking up to find the case files spread across his kitchen floor, even though he lived alone and had locked them away in his office the night before. As months passed, more bodies appeared. Not many, but enough to show it wasn't over. Each one was found in increasingly remote places, abandoned barns, dried up wells, hollowed tree trunks. Always the same carvings. Always the same hollow chest, and always that smell, impossible to wash away. The public demanded answers, but there were none. Reporters pressed for details, but even they grew reluctant to publish what little they knew. It was as if the story itself carried a curse. Families moved away, the town's population dwindled, the farmhouse eventually collapsed in on itself after a storm, but even then, no one would go near the land. By the time the case was quietly filed into the cold case archives, more than half the original team had left the force. Some transferred, some retired early, some simply disappeared without explanation. Not a single detective wanted to touch it anymore. It wasn't because they couldn't solve it, it was because the case was doing something to them, changing them, and they were terrified of what would happen if they stayed. To this day, the boxes sit in storage, unmarked, gathering dust. Officers whisper about them like a warning. Some say if you open the files, you'll start seeing the same symbols in your own home. Some say you'll smell that metallic stench in your clothes. And some say the case isn't cold at all, it's just waiting for someone foolish enough to open it again. A case so bizarre, it was locked away. There are stories buried deep in archives that were never meant to be heard again. Stories so strange and unsettling that those who investigated them wish they could erase the memory entirely. One such case unfolded in a quiet American town where life once moved slowly, where neighbors greeted each other on porches, and where nights were supposed to be calm. Yet beneath the surface of that ordinary place, something happened that would forever scar the people who lived there. It began on a cold evening in late autumn. The sun had already slipped away behind the horizon, leaving behind a gray sky that matched the empty streets. A small town in the Midwest was winding down for the night. Storefronts closed one by one, families gathered inside their homes, and only the faint hum of an old neon diner sign flickered at the edge of the main road. It should have been like any other night, yet for a handful of people, it became the beginning of something they could never explain. The first sign came from a farmhouse just outside the town limits. A family who had lived there for generations suddenly reported strange noises echoing through the halls at night. At first, it was dismissed as the old woods settling or animals scratching against the siding. But the sounds grew louder, turning into rhythmic knocks, dragging noises, and eventually faint voices that seemed to whisper just beyond the walls. The man of the house began keeping a journal. Each night, he wrote down what he heard and what he felt. His entries grew increasingly frantic, describing cold spots in the hallway, doors unlocking themselves, and the overwhelming sense that something was watching them from the shadows. One entry, smudged and nearly illegible, contained only 3 words repeated over and over again. "It knows me." When the family finally fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving dinner plates still on the table, the sheriff's office was called to investigate. Deputies walked through each room and noted the eerie silence that had settled inside. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. In one upstairs bedroom, an officer swore he heard a voice call his name even though no one else was in the room. The men laughed it off at first, but unease followed them out the door. Over the weeks that followed, the farmhouse became a place of whispered rumors. Teenagers dared each other to drive by, but few would stop. The windows always looked darker than they should have, even in daylight. Then, something happened that forced the case into the open. A pair of hunters, passing through the woods near the farmhouse at dawn, stumbled across something buried beneath a thin layer of dirt and leaves. It wasn't an animal, nor was it something that should have been there at all. It was a box. An old wooden box, nailed shut, covered in strange symbols burned into the surface. The hunters, thinking it was some kind of buried stash, pried it open with a knife. Inside, wrapped in brittle fabric, were dozens of photographs. The pictures were black and white, worn from time, yet each showed scenes that twisted the stomach. Empty rooms, broken furniture. A woman standing in the corner, her face blurred, her arms bent at impossible angles. The last photograph showed the very farmhouse itself, long before the current family had lived there. In the picture, the windows were all dark, except for one where a pale figure stood staring out. The hunters turned the box over to the sheriff, who immediately brought in state investigators. The farmhouse was searched again, this time with far more caution. Hidden in the basement behind a false wall, they found evidence that no one could explain. Strange markings carved into the stone foundation, jars filled with unrecognizable substances, and a chair bolted to the floor with restraints attached to the arms. What disturbed the investigators most was a ledger resting on a shelf, its pages filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes about rituals. Some entries were crossed out, others unfinished. The final page contained nothing but a shaky sentence written in red ink. "Do not open what was buried." The sheriff tried to keep the findings quiet, but words spread through town like wildfire. Panic set in. People who had once brushed off the stories now avoided the farmhouse entirely. As the investigation continued, more unsettling details emerged. Records showed that decades earlier, a string of disappearances had plagued the area, though most cases were dismissed or forgotten. The missing had one thing in common: they had all lived within walking distance of that farmhouse. Families had moved away, hoping to escape whatever curse lingered there. Somehow, the house remained, sold over and over again, until the latest family unknowingly stepped into its shadow. Officers who worked the case reported nightmares after spending time inside. Some described hearing scratching noises long after leaving. One deputy refused to return to the property after claiming he saw a shadow move across the ceiling, though there was no one upstairs. Another man, a state investigator, abruptly resigned after locking himself in the evidence room late at night, saying something had whispered through the vents. The box, the ledger, and the photographs were all collected as evidence, sealed inside the county archives. Yet even there, the items caused trouble. The clerk who cataloged the photographs swore the images changed slightly each time he looked at them, as though the blurred figure in the corner had shifted closer. Documents went missing, reports were shredded by mistake, and eventually, the entire file was labeled restricted access. Over time, the case was quietly forgotten by the public, buried under newer headlines. The farmhouse still stands, though its windows are boarded and its driveway is chained shut. Locals warn outsiders not to go near it, not because of trespassing laws, but because of what they believe still lingers inside. What makes the case so bizarre is not just the evidence, but the silence that followed. No official explanation was ever given. The state closed the file with a vague statement about unsubstantiated findings. But the officers who were there that autumn night remember. Some still refuse to talk about it, while others break into a cold sweat at the mention of the farmhouse. One retired deputy, when asked years later why the case had been locked away, simply shook his head and whispered, "Because it wasn't just a house, it was something else. And we should have never opened that box." Even now, the story circulates in hushed voices at diners and bars late at night. Some say the farmhouse is cursed. Others believe it was the site of something unspeakable that left a permanent stain on the land. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. It was a case so disturbing, so bizarre, that those in charge made sure it would never see the light of day again. Yet, locked away or not, the memory survives, carried by those who saw the evidence with their own eyes. And for anyone who dares to go near that old farmhouse, the warnings are always the same. Do not linger, do not go inside, and above all, never dig where the ground has already been disturbed. Disturbing files that were never released. There are some cases in American history that remain so unsettling, so deeply disturbing, that the files connected to them were sealed away, hidden from the public eye. Not because of national security, but because those who saw what was inside could not bring themselves to ever let it be released. These are the files that were whispered about in dimly lit hallways of police stations, the ones that detectives carried in thick folders stained with coffee rings, marked only with red tape and stamped with the word restricted. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It began in a small town tucked deep in the Midwest, a quiet place where most people knew one another. Life moved slowly there, the nights silent except for crickets and the occasional hum of a passing train. But in late autumn, when the days grew short and the air carried that sharp chill, something happened that would tear at the seams of reality itself. On a gray afternoon, a woman walked into the county sheriff's office. Her hair was damp from the drizzle outside, her eyes wide, and her voice shook as she explained that her brother hadn't been home for 3 days. He wasn't the type to vanish. He worked at the mill, showed up on time, paid his bills, and never left town without saying a word. But now his car sat abandoned on the edge of a service road near the woods, keys still in the ignition, driver's door wide open. When deputies first went to investigate, they expected to find a man who had simply wandered off or had some kind of accident. But the scene gave them no comfort. The car sat oddly positioned, not on the road itself, but angled sharply into the ditch as if it had stopped suddenly. The interior was undisturbed, wallet still in the glove box, and nothing was stolen. What caught their attention most was a smear of something on the back seat. At first, they thought it was mud, but under the flashlight's beam, it carried a darker tone, clotted and rust-colored. Blood. Deputies called for backup, and soon the woods were alive with searchers. Flashlights cut through the thick pines, dogs barked, and the cold drizzle turned the earth into slick mud. Hours passed. No sign of the man, but in the farthest part of the woods, near a clearing that hunters sometimes used, they found something else. Laid out on the wet ground was a collection of papers. Dozens of pages, their corners warped from moisture, each one covered in typed lines and handwritten notes. The documents were old, far older than the man's disappearance, but there was something about them that made the deputies uneasy. They seemed to describe medical procedures, but not the kind anyone had ever read before. Descriptions of experiments carried out on unwilling subjects, with dates, times, and initials scrawled in the margins. At first, deputies assumed it was a hoax, some kind of strange prank left behind by kids. But the more they read, the more it became clear these pages weren't written for amusement. They spoke of things done to people who had been taken against their will, procedures that defied normal medical standards, procedures that no ethical board would ever approve. The man's body was never found. Not that night, not the next day, not even in the weeks that followed. But the documents were collected, sealed in evidence bags, and locked away. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. Within a month, another disappearance was reported, this time a teenage girl who had last been seen walking home from her friend's house. Again, her belongings were found abandoned, this time her backpack tossed at the side of a road as if it had been dropped mid-stride. When searchers combed the nearby fields, They found more papers, this time carefully folded and placed inside a glass jar. And once again, the writings detailed horrific acts along with disturbing sketches of human figures, drawn crudely but clear enough to show what was being done. By now, the sheriff's department was overwhelmed. They requested assistance from state police, who in turn passed the case upward. Soon, federal agents arrived in black sedans, the kind of men who didn't smile and didn't share what they knew. They collected everything, the papers, the photographs that had been taken at the scenes, even the deputies' handwritten notes, and took them to a secure facility. The files grew thicker as the months dragged on. More disappearances followed, though not always in the same county. Sometimes in neighboring states, sometimes miles away, but always with the same calling card, strange documents left behind, typed in the same font, marked with the same initials. The people who read them said the files had a way of staying with you, even when you tried to forget. Investigators described dreams that woke them in the night, filled with voices that weren't theirs, faces they had never seen, and an overwhelming sense of dread that followed them through the day. Some agents requested transfers. Some simply quit. A few reportedly disappeared themselves. The towns where these events unfolded changed too. Businesses closed early, streets emptied after dark, and rumors spread that the woods were cursed. Parents no longer let their children walk alone. And yet, despite all the fear, there were never any arrests, never a suspect brought into custody. The files sat in storage, gathering dust, locked behind steel cabinets and guarded by silence. One retired officer, years later, confessed to a reporter that he had seen a portion of the files before they were taken away. His hands trembled as he described what he read, detailed accounts of people being subjected to tests in underground facilities, places no one could identify on any map. He said the files contained photographs too, grainy and poorly lit, but horrifying in their clarity. They showed rooms lined with rusted tables, restraints bolted into concrete floors, and people staring blankly into the lens, as though whatever had been done to them had hollowed them out completely. That officer broke down before he could finish. No one knows for certain who wrote the documents or why they were always found near the sites of disappearances. Some believe it was the work of a cult, others whisper about government experiments long denied. But those who have seen even a glimpse of the evidence agree on one thing. The files should never be released, not because the truth would be too confusing, but because it would be too devastating. The story of those disturbing files has become almost a legend in law enforcement circles. Sometimes, new recruits are warned with a simple phrase, "There are cases you don't want to dig into," cases where the answers, if found, would leave you broken. And when the lights flicker in the records room late at night, clerks whisper about the sealed cabinets, the ones marked with red tape, and the cases no one is allowed to open. The terrifying discovery beneath the houses. On a quiet stretch of land just outside of Ashford, a small town in the American Midwest, there stood an old farmhouse that locals avoided after dark. The property had been empty for decades, its wooden frame weathered by endless winters and long, humid summers. The paint had peeled away to gray splinters, the shutters hung loose, and the porch sagged under its own weight. Children riding their bikes past the dirt road whispered that the house breathed at night, that if you stopped long enough, you could hear faint scratching coming from under the floor. Adults, of course, dismissed it as folklore, but no one really lingered there, not even the brave ones. The land was purchased by a middle-aged couple who had recently moved from the city. They wanted space, peace, and maybe even the kind of charm that came with an old house, the sort of place that could be restored and lived in proudly. The property was large, surrounded by acres of tall grass that bent like waves when the wind picked up. At dusk, deer wandered out of the woods at the far edge of the land, their silhouettes quiet and watchful against the horizon. The couple arrived one chilly evening in late autumn, boxes stacked in the back of a pickup truck. The air smelled of damp earth, and the house loomed before them like something frozen in time. The first night inside, with lanterns instead of steady electricity, was unsettling. The boards creaked under every step. Dust floated in the beams of their flashlights, and the wind rattled the loose shingles on the roof. They chalked it up to the character of an old place, the sort of thing they had signed up for. But beneath the surface of that house was something they had not signed up for. Something that would unravel their peace and turn the property into a nightmare. It began on the second week during renovations. Early one morning, just as the sun was climbing above the tree line, the husband pried open a section of rotted floorboards near the back room. He was planning to reinforce the support beams underneath. As he pulled the boards away, a wave of damp, earthy air hit him different from the ordinary smell of mold or dust. This was heavier, rancid, almost metallic. He leaned closer with a flashlight, expecting to see soil or maybe a nest of animals. Instead, the beam caught what looked like the edge of stone. Not natural stone, but carved, straight lines. Deliberate. He called for his wife, and together they peered into the opening. The gap was narrow, but it revealed a dark space beneath the house, deeper than a crawl space. The stone appeared to be part of a wall, a structure hidden underground. Curiosity outweighed fear, and by late afternoon, they had widened the hole enough to descend with a ladder. The air grew colder as they went down, their breaths visible in the light. The small chamber beneath the house was made of old brick, its ceiling low enough to force them to crouch. It didn't feel like a basement, more like a hidden cellar. The bricks were stained dark, and faint markings were etched along the walls. Some looked like crude symbols, others like scratch marks made by desperate hands. In the far corner of the chamber sat a wooden chest, its lid swollen with age. The husband hesitated, but the wife urged him to open it. When the lid groaned upward, the smell of decay flooded the room. Inside were bundles of fabric, blackened and brittle with age. At first, they thought it was clothing, until the wife noticed what was wrapped inside the folds. Small bones, stacked carefully, arranged as if someone had placed them with intention. They recoiled in shock. These were not animal remains, they were unmistakably human. The couple scrambled back to the ladder, their flashlights shaking in their hands, the air pressing heavy on their chests. Once outside, they sat on the porch in silence, staring at the tree line as the sky dimmed into twilight. Neither wanted to be the first to admit what they had found. That night, the scratching began. At first, it was faint, like mice scuttling behind the walls. But as the hours dragged on, the sound grew sharper, more deliberate. Long drags across the wood, as though someone with broken nails was clawing upward from beneath the floor. Sleep was impossible. The wife swore she heard muffled cries beneath the house, not loud enough to be words, but rhythmic, pleading. The husband dismissed it as imagination, though his own hands trembled as he lit another lantern. Around 3 a.m, every lantern in the house flickered at once, and the scratching stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. The following morning, the couple decided to contact the county sheriff. When deputies arrived, they descended into the cellar with masks and stronger lights. Hours passed, and when they resurfaced, their faces were pale. They confirmed the bones were human. Multiple sets. Children and adults alike. The chamber beneath the house was larger than it first appeared, extending into narrow tunnels. One of the deputies muttered that the structure looked older than the house itself, possibly older than the town. Word spread quickly, and soon the house drew attention from locals, journalists, and even historians. Old records revealed whispers of disappearances in Ashford, families that had vanished without explanation, farmhands who walked off shifts and never came back. Rumors told of rituals, of a group that had once gathered in hidden chambers, lured by promises of power or protection. Nothing had ever been proven, but the cellar beneath the farmhouse seemed to confirm the worst fears. The couple was told they could leave, that the property would be sealed off during the investigation, but something in them resisted. The wife claimed she felt watched whenever she tried to pack. The husband confessed he couldn't shake the feeling that if they left, whatever was beneath the house would follow. At night, the scratching returned. Sometimes it was beneath the floorboards, other times it echoed in the walls or from the attic above. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the wife heard a soft knocking from beneath the floor. Not frantic, not scratching, just 3 slow knocks, repeating. She froze, her skin crawling. When she whispered her husband's name, the knocks stopped. He rushed into the room only to find fresh cracks spreading across the floorboards where the sound had come from. The sheriff's office continued to explore the tunnels, but progress was slow. Some passages collapsed without warning, others led into dead ends marked with strange carvings. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, until their lights barely penetrated the darkness. At one point, a deputy reported hearing footsteps behind him, though the others swore no one was there. Another deputy refused to return after claiming he heard a voice whisper his name. The couple's final night in the house came without warning. Around midnight, a storm rolled in, thunder shaking the old frame of the farmhouse. Rain hammered the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks. In the chaos, the wife screamed. Her husband rushed to her, only to see her standing in the living room pointing at the floor. The boards had begun to bow upward, as if something beneath them was pressing against the wood. The scratching was deafening now, joined by muffled cries, dozens of voices rising in agony. The boards split, dust and splinters flying, and through the cracks came the sight of pale, skeletal fingers reaching upward. The husband grabbed his wife, dragging her toward the door as the floor gave way behind them. Lanterns toppled, glass shattered, and the house filled with the stench of rot and earth. They ran into the storm, the rain soaking their clothes, their hearts pounding as they turned back to see the farmhouse shaking as though alive. Windows burst outward, the roof groaned, and the sound of those voices carried into the night, a wailing chorus of despair and rage. By dawn, when the storm had passed, the farmhouse stood silent. The couple never returned. Officials who came later found the house intact, but the floor in the back room was splintered and gaping. The chamber below had collapsed, burying whatever tunnels had existed. The chest was gone. To this day, locals say the farmhouse remains cursed. Hunters who pass by at night claim they see lantern light flickering in the windows, though the property has long been abandoned. Some swear they hear scratching when the wind is still. Others say if you press your ear to the ground near the back of the house, you can hear faint knocking, patient and deliberate, waiting for someone to answer. And in Ashford, no one dares to buy the property anymore. The land sits empty, the farmhouse sagging deeper into decay, its secrets sealed beneath the soil. But every so often, when the moon is high and the air is still, the town remembers what was found under that house. And they whisper of the terrifying discovery that was never fully explained, a reminder that some places are built on more than just earth and stone. Some are built on something far darker. Cases too disturbing for the headlines. On a cold evening in late autumn, when the air carried that sharp bite that seemed to creep straight into the bones, a small town in Pennsylvania found itself at the center of a nightmare that would never be printed in its local paper. The town was quiet. Rows of dimly lit houses along narrow streets, the kind of place where people locked their doors but still trusted their neighbors enough to wave goodnight. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there until one night when something so disturbing unfolded that even the most hardened investigators struggled to put it into words. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It began just after 9 when a call came into the county sheriff's office. A neighbor reported hearing screams coming from a farmhouse that stood on the edge of town. The farmhouse was old, weathered wood splintering beneath layers of paint that had long since given up fighting the years. For decades, it had been home to a family that mostly kept to themselves. The caller's voice shook as he described the sound, high-pitched, ragged, not the kind of cry you'd expect from someone startled or angry. It was the kind of scream that made the hair on your arms stand straight. The kind that hinted at something primal, something wrong. 2 deputies arrived on scene within minutes. The yard was silent, the gravel driveway scattered with wet leaves. The porch light flickered, swaying slightly in the wind. They approached cautiously, knocking on the door, announcing themselves. No answer. What they found when they stepped inside would haunt them for years to come. The living room smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Furniture was overturned, photographs shattered on the floor, glass crunching under their boots. The deputies moved slowly, flashlights cutting through the shadows. In the kitchen, the table was set for dinner, plates still warm, food untouched. Chairs lay scattered as though people had been startled in the middle of a meal, and then in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, they saw it. Dark streaks along the wall, smeared handprints dragged downward, as though someone had clawed desperately at the surface trying to hold on. The prints led toward a closed door at the far end. With weapons drawn, they pushed forward, calling out again. No response. When the door swung open, the beam of light revealed a scene that froze them in place. 3 family members were there, lifeless, positioned in a way that was almost deliberate, as if staged. Eyes wide, mouths slightly open, their bodies placed side by side on the floor. Each one had marks around the wrists, as though bound at some point, but the restraints were gone. And the most chilling part, each had the same expression of terror carved across their face, as though whatever they had seen in their final moments was far worse than the violence itself. The 4th member of the household, the youngest, was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the fields behind the farmhouse, flashlights bobbing in the night, calling out her name. Hours passed with no trace. The woods felt oppressive, the air unnaturally still, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath heavy boots. When dawn broke, investigators found a trail leading deeper into the trees, small footprints pressed into the damp earth, ending abruptly at a creek that wound its way through the forest. There, half buried in mud, was a single shoe. The child was never seen again. News outlets picked up whispers of the case, but details were scarce. The sheriff's office refused to release photographs, citing their disturbing nature. Local reporters who pressed too hard were warned off, told that some things were better left unsaid. The official story spoke only of a tragic incident, no specifics, no follow-up. To this day, the files remain sealed, stored in a cabinet deep within the county courthouse basement, marked with a single word across the folder: withheld. But that was only one case. Years later, hundreds of miles away, in a small town in Kentucky, another story unfolded that shared the same unnerving silence in its aftermath. It was late summer when a young couple driving home along a rural highway spotted something unusual. Just past midnight, headlights caught the figure of a man standing in the middle of the road. He didn't move, didn't flinch at the blaring horn. The couple swerved, heart pounding, pulling to the shoulder. When they looked back, the man was gone. Shaken, they continued on, only to find a pickup truck parked half a mile ahead, engine still running, driver's door wide open. The radio played softly inside, static breaking through faint country music. A wallet sat on the dashboard, filled with cash and identification. But the driver was nowhere in sight. Deputies searched the area until sunrise. In the nearby field, they found strange patterns carved into the grass, wide circles pressed flat, as if something massive had landed there. The missing man's footprints were scattered, moving in frantic directions before cutting off completely at the edge of one of the circles. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where he went. The case was quietly filed as a missing person. But investigators who had seen the scene spoke privately of something they couldn't explain. The story never reached the papers. There are dozens more hidden away in forgotten archives. In a small Illinois town, a family disappeared overnight, their house left perfectly intact, dinner dishes still in the sink, laundry folded neatly on the couch, even the family dog locked inside the bedroom, barking frantically when police entered. Every trace of the family was gone. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just silence. Weeks of searching turned up nothing. Eventually, the house was sold, repainted, and passed to a new family. But neighbors whispered about lights flickering in the windows late at night, shadows moving when the house should have been empty. None of those reports were ever taken seriously. The official story vanished into silence. And in Oregon, a group of hikers stumbled across something they would never forget: Deep in the woods, miles from any trail, they found a clearing filled with dozens of animal bones arranged in intricate patterns. At the center, a large wooden cross stood upright, draped in torn pieces of clothing. Tucked into the branches above, a weathered photograph of a child smiled down, pinned with rusted nails. Authorities who investigated labeled it a disturbed individual's work, dismissed it as unsettling but not criminal. Yet those who saw it firsthand swore that the bones weren't all animal. Some, they insisted, looked far too human. These are cases too disturbing for the headlines, stories that never made it to the evening news, hidden behind closed doors and sealed files. They are spoken about in hushed tones by investigators long since retired, men and women who wake in the night with memories of things they cannot forget. The public will never know the full details. Perhaps it is mercy, perhaps it is fear. Because sometimes what really happens in the shadows of small towns and quiet highways is far worse than any headline could ever capture. And sometimes the silence that follows is the loudest sound of all. Unimaginable crimes buried in forgotten files. The courthouse basement smelled of dust and mold, a stale heaviness that seemed to cling to the walls, no matter how often the janitors sprayed disinfectant. It was a place no one wanted to linger in, with flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead and boxes stacked on metal shelves, each one labeled with fading marker, case numbers barely legible after years of neglect. Most of these files belonged to long-closed cases, matters that the system had stamped with finality. Yet, hidden among them were folders that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than simple legal disputes. Files that had been quietly pushed into the corners, cases that no one wanted to reopen, crimes so disturbing that people thought silence was safer than truth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a stormy evening in late October, a clerk searching for property records stumbled on a set of boxes marked only with a red X. They were heavier than the others, filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and brittle police reports yellowed with time. She didn't know it then, but those boxes contained accounts of events that had never been explained, horrors that had been deliberately buried. These were not cases that appeared on the news anymore, if they ever truly did. They were crimes the town had agreed to forget, yet the details inside those folders painted a different picture. The first file contained reports from a small town in the Midwest, where in the early hours of a winter morning, a farmhouse was found completely abandoned. Breakfast had been set on the table, eggs half cooked on the stove, but no one was inside. The family of 5 was simply gone. Neighbors swore they had seen the father chopping wood the night before, his breath misting in the cold air. Yet, when investigators combed through the house, they discovered something that still defies explanation. Every clock in the home had stopped at the same moment. Each watch, each wall clock, even the small wristwatch tucked in a dresser drawer, all frozen at exactly 2:17 a.m. No bodies were ever recovered, no evidence of forced entry, no tracks in the snow, just silence and the eerie stillness of a house caught in time. The file included black and white photographs of the kitchen, of the empty beds where the children should have been sleeping, of muddy footprints leading from the back door to the edge of the woods before abruptly vanishing. Officers wrote in their notes that the woods had been searched for days, dogs had been brought in, but the trail ended in nothing. The case was eventually closed with no resolution, the family listed as missing, presumed dead. But what chilled the clerk reading those reports wasn't the official conclusion. It was a single page tucked between the evidence logs, a handwritten statement from a deputy who had since retired. He wrote that during the search, he heard children's laughter echoing through the forest, even though no one was there. Another box held records from a coastal town in Maine. A fishing vessel had washed ashore without a crew. The boat was still running, lights glowing faintly in the fog, nets half pulled in, but not a single person was found on board. The captain, 2 deckhands, even the dog that usually accompanied them, gone. What was strange, investigators noted, was that all of their personal belongings remained untouched. Wallets, cigarettes, even half-eaten sandwiches were left in place as if the men had simply vanished mid-task. Blood samples were collected from the deck, smeared along the railing, though no one could determine whose blood it was. The most disturbing piece in that file was a photograph of the captain's logbook. The last entry read, "The sea is singing tonight, and we are not alone." The handwriting became erratic, ink smudged by what looked like water before the words trailed off into illegible scrawls. The Coast Guard searched for weeks, dragging the waters, but not a single body was ever recovered. Families demanded answers, officials offered theories of mutiny or drowning, but no evidence supported any explanation. Eventually, the file was marked closed, unsolved, and placed in the forgotten pile. The deeper the clerk dug into those boxes, the darker the stories became. One folder described a roadside motel in Nevada where several travelers had checked in on different nights, none of whom ever checked out. Cars were left in the parking lot, luggage neatly stacked in the rooms, but the guests themselves disappeared without a trace. Housekeepers swore they felt watched while cleaning those rooms, and some refused to enter them alone. Local deputies searched the property, pulled up carpet, even dismantled floorboards, yet they found nothing. Still, the disappearances continued until the motel abruptly shut down, its owner leaving town overnight. Rumor had it that some of the rooms were sealed off, padlocked from the outside, but when the building was eventually demolished years later, no one spoke about what might have been discovered inside. One of the most unsettling files contained a series of crime scene photographs from a small community outside New Orleans. They showed a single street where, one by one, entire households had been found dead, yet not a single wound was visible on any of the victims. Men, women, children, even pets, lifeless but without explanation. Autopsies revealed no poison, no signs of struggle, no cause of death at all. Their expressions, however, were what haunted the investigators. Each face was frozen in terror, eyes wide, mouths open, as if they had seen something so horrifying it stopped their hearts instantly. The reports ended abruptly, with no official conclusion. But at the bottom of the folder, someone had scrawled a note on the back of an evidence tag. It read, "Do not reopen. Some truths are not meant to be known." As the storm raged outside the courthouse, the clerk flipped through more files. She found witness accounts of lights in the sky above remote farmland, photographs of symbols carved into trees deep in Appalachian woods, coroner's reports from bodies found miles away from where they had disappeared, untouched by animals, preserved as if time itself had stopped around them. Every story had been silenced. Reporters were warned off, families told to stop asking questions, and communities left to quietly heal without answers. Yet reading through the notes, it was clear the investigators themselves had been shaken, writing words like unexplainable, unnatural, and beyond comprehension. The last box was the heaviest. Inside were recordings, old cassette tapes from interviews. One tape had no label, only a scratch across its plastic surface. Curious, the clerk played it in an old machine she found in the office. The recording was faint, voices distorted, but she could make out the sound of someone breathing heavily, followed by a man whispering, "It's here with us." It never left. Then came a scream, high-pitched and sudden, before the tape cut off into static. She slammed the stop button, her hands trembling. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder than before, or maybe it was just her own pulse in her ears. She wanted to leave, to run upstairs into the safety of the night watchman's presence, but part of her couldn't stop reading. She flipped through the last set of documents, which contained lists of names, all typed neatly in columns. At the bottom of each list was the same note: file closed, evidence destroyed. Except the evidence wasn't destroyed. It had been hidden down here, waiting to be found again. And as she stood in that basement, thunder rolling outside and rain lashing against the small windows, she realized something that chilled her to her core. Some of the most recent files weren't old at all. They were dated within the last decade, and the names on the missing persons lists included people she recognized, neighbors, coworkers, even a distant cousin whose disappearance had never been explained. Her breath caught as she noticed a fresh folder sitting at the top of one pile. The paper still crisp, the ink dark. On the cover was her own town's name. She hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper with a heading she had seen too many times that night. It read, "Unimaginable Crimes. Status, buried." The room felt colder, the shadows seemed to stretch longer. She shut the folder, shoved it back into the box, and stumbled toward the stairwell. But as she reached for the light switch, she froze. The basement door above her was closed. She hadn't heard it shut. And from the far corner of the basement, where the shelves disappeared into darkness, came the faint sound of children laughing. She ran, heart pounding, refusing to look back, refusing to listen. The boxes remained where they had been, buried in forgotten files, their secrets intact. Yet those who had read them could never truly walk away. Because once you opened the door to those crimes, once you saw what the world had tried to erase, you understood the terrible truth. Some crimes are too dark to be solved, some horrors are never meant to see daylight, and some files are buried not because they were forgotten, but because remembering them would destroy everything we believe about safety, about justice, about reality itself. The mystery that drove detectives insane. It began on a gray October morning when the quiet town of Ashford, nestled deep in the hills of Pennsylvania, awoke to the kind of silence that feels unnatural, the kind of silence that makes you feel as though the world is holding its breath. The town was small, a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where the grocery clerk asked about your children, and where life moved at a pace that never felt rushed. But on that morning, when the air was heavy with fog and the streets glistened from a night of steady rain, the calm routine of the town was about to be torn apart. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? At exactly 7:42 a.m. A call came in to the county sheriff's office. The voice on the other end was trembling, uneven, as if struggling to form the words. A man named Harold Turner, a truck driver who had pulled over to check his tires near an abandoned farmhouse on Old Mill Road, claimed he had seen something so disturbing that his voice broke while describing it. He insisted there was a figure lying motionless in the grass beside the farmhouse and strange markings covering the walls as if someone had gone mad with red paint. Within minutes, 2 deputies were dispatched, and by 8:15 a.m., the first reports began filtering back. It was not paint. The walls of the decaying farmhouse were covered in streaks of blood, and the body lying in the tall, wet grass was not just any body. It was positioned in such a deliberate and unnatural way that it sent chills through even the most seasoned officers. Arms extended straight out, legs bent at sharp angles, and the head tilted to face the sky with eyes wide open, as though the victim had been forced into a grotesque pose before life was taken from them. The coroner was called, and as the body was examined, it was revealed that the victim had no identification, no wallet, no phone, nothing to indicate who they were. Their clothes were generic, the kind one might buy at any discount store, but there was something unusual. Sewn into the lining of the jacket was a small piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age, on which strange symbols were scrawled in dark ink. No one at the scene could decipher it. By late morning, detectives from the county's investigative unit arrived. Among them was Detective Marshall, a man with 20 years on the force, known for his calm under pressure, and Detective Reeves, younger but sharp, with a reputation for connecting dots that others overlooked. As they stepped inside the farmhouse, both men felt something shift in their stomachs. The air was thick, damp, and filled with the sour smell of rot. The wooden floors creaked as though groaning under an unseen weight, and the blood smeared across the walls seemed to form patterns rather than random splatters. Reeves muttered under his breath, pointing at the largest smear on the far wall. It was not just blood, but a circle, crudely drawn, with jagged lines cutting through it like rays. Around it were smaller markings, symbols that matched the parchment hidden in the victim's coat. No fingerprints, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this had moved with precision, leaving behind something that felt more like a message than a crime scene. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and soon the small town was drowning in rumor. Some whispered about cult activity, others about a drifter passing through, and some insisted it was something darker, something that could not be explained by rational means. The local newspaper printed a front-page story calling it "The Ritual on Old Mill Road," and overnight, fear rooted itself in the town's heart. The investigation deepened. The victim's fingerprints were run through every available database, but there was no match. Dental records revealed nothing. It was as though the person had never officially existed. And then, just as detectives were grappling with this void of information, another discovery was made. Exactly 1 week after the farmhouse incident, at the same time in the morning, another body appeared. This time on the steps of the old courthouse downtown, a place long abandoned and condemned, its windows shattered and its halls crawling with vines. Once again, the body was arranged in a twisted pose with a parchment hidden in the clothing. The symbols matched. The blood painted across the courthouse doors formed another strange pattern, different from the first, but equally deliberate. Detectives Marshall and Reeves felt the weight of something that was no longer a simple crime. These were not random murders, not crimes of passion or opportunity. Someone was leaving behind a trail, constructing something larger than any of them could comprehend. The two men pored over the parchments late into the night, spreading them across the desk under dim fluorescent lights. They called in experts from nearby universities, linguists, historians, even cryptographers. Each one studied the markings, and each one came back with the same unsettling response. The symbols did not belong to any known language, any known culture. They seemed invented, yet carried a strange logic of their own, as though designed to communicate something beyond human understanding. As the weeks passed, the murders continued. Every 7 days, like clockwork, another body appeared in another forgotten place around the county. An abandoned church, a railway tunnel, a shuttered motel on the edge of town. Always the same patterns, always the same symbols, always the same absence of identity in the victims, and always the same growing sense of dread among the investigators. Detective Marshall, who had once prided himself on rationality, began to lose sleep. He confessed to Reeves that he heard whispers at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, repeating words he could not understand. Reeves, though skeptical, admitted that he too felt a constant pressure, a sense of being watched when alone. Their colleagues noticed their decline. What had begun as a case had become an obsession, one that clawed at their sanity with every passing day. The media attention swelled, with reporters descending on Ashford, painting it as a town cursed, a place gripped by an unseen terror. Residents began locking their doors before sundown, avoiding the streets after dark. Churches filled with people desperate for comfort, while others fled the town entirely. Businesses closed, leaving storefronts empty. The once quiet community had been hollowed out, consumed by fear. Then came the night that finally broke the detectives. It was bitterly cold, with frost coating the ground like glass. A call came in at 3:17 a.m., reporting movement at the abandoned railway tunnel where one of the bodies had been found. Marshall and Reeves rushed to the scene, flashlights cutting through the icy darkness. As they stepped inside the tunnel, their beams illuminated something that stopped them cold. The walls were no longer streaked with old graffiti, but covered in fresh blood, thick and wet, spelling out words they could almost read. As they moved deeper, the symbols began to shift. curving into forms that resembled letters, as though the unknown language had begun merging with English. And at the far end of the tunnel, sitting upright against the wall, was a figure they recognized. It was Harold Turner, the truck driver who had first called in the farmhouse discovery. His eyes were open, his expression frozen in terror, his hands clutching another parchment. On it, scrawled in shaky handwriting that was unmistakably human this time, were the words, "They are coming and you cannot stop them." The sound that followed was one Marshall would never forget. A low hum vibrating through the steel of the tunnel, so deep it rattled their bones. Reeves dropped his flashlight, and in that moment of darkness, something moved. Not footsteps, not the shifting of a person, but a ripple, as though the air itself was alive. When they scrambled back toward the entrance, both men swore they saw shadows that did not belong to them, stretching unnaturally along the walls, reaching out like hands. In the weeks that followed, the case unraveled. Reports were filed, but the words within them made no sense. Evidence vanished from storage, parchments crumbled to dust as though they had never existed. The higher authorities dismissed it all as hysteria, a town caught in the grip of collective fear. Detectives who had worked themselves to exhaustion and lost their grip on reality. Marshall resigned not long after, retreating to a cabin in the woods where no one could reach him. Reeves disappeared entirely, his apartment left unlocked, his belongings untouched, as though he had simply walked out and never returned. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind no answers, only scars. To this day, the story of Ashford is whispered about in Pennsylvania, the tale of a mystery so profound it drove the best detectives to madness. Some claim it was a cult, others that it was something far older, something that had slipped into our world for reasons no one could explain. But those who were closest to it know one thing: it was not a case that could be solved. It was a message and perhaps a warning. And sometimes, late at night, in the silence of those empty streets, locals say you can still hear it. That low hum, faint but unmistakable, rolling through the hills like a promise. A sound that reminds them the mystery was never truly over. It was only waiting. A murder mystery too twisted to solve. It was late evening when the wind began to stir through the quiet streets of a small town in northern America. The sky was heavy with clouds, the moon only occasionally breaking through, casting pale light over the narrow roads. In the distance, the sound of a church bell echoed faintly, almost swallowed by the cold air. At that very moment, no one realized that something dreadful was about to unfold, something that would haunt investigators and residents alike for years to come. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The town was the kind of place where everyone believed they knew each other. Houses stood close together, with porches that looked out toward empty sidewalks. Street lamps flickered as if struggling to keep their glow alive. It was just after 10 p.m. when the local police received a call that changed everything. A neighbor, shaken and out of breath, reported screams coming from the house at the corner of Willow Street. The screams were sharp, desperate, and then, suddenly, they stopped. When the first patrol car arrived, the neighborhood was already on edge. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and uneasy faces peeked out. The house in question stood silent, its front porch lights swinging in the wind as if someone had passed under it in a hurry. Officers knocked on the door but received no answer. After a tense moment, they forced their way inside. The interior of the house felt wrong immediately. A faint smell of iron filled the air, unmistakably metallic. The living room was dim, the lamp knocked over, casting eerie shadows across the walls. A half-finished cup of coffee still sat on the table, steam long gone, as if someone had been interrupted mid-sip. In the kitchen, chairs were overturned, one of them broken at the leg. And then, in the hallway, they found it. A body lying face down, blood pooled beneath. The victim had been struck repeatedly, the brutality suggesting rage more than intention. What made it all the more disturbing was the detail that none of the doors or windows had been forced open. Whoever did this had either been let inside willingly or was already in the house. By midnight, detectives were swarming the scene. One of them, a seasoned investigator who had seen his share of violence, admitted quietly that this case felt different, darker somehow. The victim's belongings were untouched, wallet and jewelry left behind, ruling out robbery. A series of photographs were discovered scattered on the floor, showing the victim with various friends and family. Yet, one photo stood out. It had been ripped in half, the missing piece showing only a shadow where another person had once been. The autopsy revealed something that sent chills even deeper. The injuries did not match a single weapon. It looked as though multiple methods had been used, almost ritualistic in nature. The coroner's report mentioned hesitation wounds, as if the killer had changed their mind halfway through, then continued with even greater force. As the investigation widened, the neighbors began sharing fragments of strange experiences. One elderly woman said she had noticed a tall figure standing across the street several nights in a row, unmoving, watching the house, disappearing before she could call anyone. Another resident swore they heard footsteps in their backyard at odd hours, though no one was ever found. Police combed through hours of surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic lights, but something bizarre kept happening. Whenever the suspect might have appeared on camera, the footage glitched. Frames skipped, figures blurred into unrecognizable smears, as though the very image resisted being captured. Weeks passed, and suspicion fell on several people close to the victim. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives were interrogated. Secrets began surfacing, revealing hidden grudges, financial troubles, and long-buried conflicts. But every lead seemed to collapse into nothing. Alibis checked out, motives were plausible but not conclusive, and physical evidence pointed in conflicting directions. The case grew colder, but the town itself did not rest easy. Strange calls began flooding the local police line. Residents reported hearing screams at night coming from empty lots. Others claimed they saw fleeting shadows darting across windows when no one was inside. Children woke crying, telling their parents they saw someone standing at the foot of their bed, someone tall with eyes that seemed hollow. Detectives tried to dismiss these claims as fear spreading in a shaken community, but even they could not deny what was happening during interviews. On more than one occasion, while questioning potential witnesses, the lights in the room flickered violently, and audio recorders captured faint whispers that no one present had spoken. The words were never clear, but one phrase repeated often enough to be noticed: "You can't find me." In one of the most unsettling turns, the original 911 call from the neighbor was revisited. When replayed, investigators realized that beneath the frantic voice, another sound lingered faintly. A whisper, distorted, almost laughing. Yet when the audio was enhanced, the voice vanished, replaced by static, as though the tape itself refused to give away its secret. By now, the community was spiraling into paranoia. People locked their doors earlier, kept lights on through the night, and avoided walking alone. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. Some swore they saw a figure in reflective surfaces, in mirrors and dark windows, a presence that always seemed one step out of reach. Despite the chilling atmosphere, the police continued piecing together what they could. A breakthrough seemed near when a small, blood-stained note was discovered in the lining of the victim's coat. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared, but it carried a single sentence that unsettled everyone who read it. It said simply, "You will never understand." This note sparked endless theories. Some believed the killer was mocking investigators. Others thought it was the victim's desperate attempt to leave a clue. But the handwriting matched no one in their circle, not even remotely. Months turned into years, and the case officially remained unsolved. Yet the file stayed open on the desks of those who worked it, haunting them like an unfinished puzzle. Detectives admitted privately that they sometimes dreamed of the crime scene, waking drenched in sweat, certain they had seen the shadow of the killer standing in their own bedroom. Even today, the house on Willow Street remains empty. The curtains are drawn, the yard overgrown, the structure slowly decaying. People avoid walking past it, crossing to the other side of the road. Children dare each other to step onto the porch, but rarely make it past the first stair. Those who do swear they feel a crushing heaviness in their chest, as though the house itself rejects their presence. Local folklore has grown around the case, transforming the murder into something larger, something darker. They say the killer was never meant to be caught, that it was less a person and more a force, something that feeds on confusion and fear. Others insist the victim themselves was not innocent, that secrets buried in that house led to an ending too twisted for the living to fully grasp. Whatever the truth may be, the murder mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Because in the silence of that house, in the flicker of those failing street lamps, and in the restless dreams of those who remember, something still lingers. Waiting, watching, daring anyone to try and unravel what cannot be explained. And each time the wind passes through the broken windows of Willow Street, carrying with it a low and hollow whistle, the town is reminded that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some truths are too twisted to face, and some killers may still be out there unseen, yet never gone. The town that hid its darkest secret. The road into the small town was always quiet at night, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt cutting through endless fields of corn that swayed beneath the pale glow of the moon. Travelers who passed by would often remark how the place seemed frozen in time, as though the decades had moved on everywhere else but here. The welcome sign, chipped and leaning slightly to the right, greeted visitors with fading letters, declaring the name of the town proudly, though few outsiders ever stopped long enough to remember it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It was just past midnight when the first unsettling incident began. A thin mist rolled in from the nearby river, curling low against the ground and weaving between the wooden houses that lined the main street. Most of the town was asleep, curtains drawn tight, doors locked, as though the residents all shared the same unspoken understanding that nothing good ever happened after dark. On the far edge of town, a lone diner sat glowing beneath buzzing neon lights. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. A handful of locals sat scattered across the booths, their conversations hushed, eyes occasionally drifting toward the wide windows that looked out into the night. The bell above the door rang, and for a moment, the entire diner fell silent. A man stepped in, his face pale and clothes damp, as though he had walked straight through the mist itself. Without speaking, he slid into a booth near the back, his trembling hands clasped around a worn leather bag. The waitress, a middle-aged woman who had worked there her whole life, poured him coffee without asking. She glanced down at the bag, then back at his face, and for the briefest moment, her expression hardened, as if she recognized something no one else could. She leaned close, whispering words too low for anyone else to hear, and the man nodded slowly. Whatever passed between them left the other customers uneasy. They pretended to focus on their meals, but the tension in the room was undeniable. At 3 a.m, the church bell rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound carried across the town, deep and hollow, waking those who had been resting fitfully in their beds. Curtains were parted, lights flicked on, and whispers spread through the night air like sparks in dry grass. The bell was never supposed to ring at that hour, not since the tragedy that had taken place long ago. People knew it, and yet no one dared step outside to check. By dawn, the mist had lifted, but unease clung to the town like a shadow. Children walked to school with their parents close by, every set of eyes watching the empty church tower at the center of town. The man from the diner was nowhere to be found. The booth he had sat in was empty, though the waitress swore she had watched him walk toward the back door before the bell had rung. His coffee cup remained on the table, the liquid inside, now stone cold, but the bag was gone. For days, whispers filled the town. Some said the man had been part of the old families, the ones who had lived here since the town's founding, before records were kept properly. Others swore he carried evidence of what had really happened during the fire that destroyed half the town square decades ago. The fire had always been explained as an accident, but deep down, many suspected there was more to it. The town rebuilt quickly, too quickly, and certain names disappeared from records, erased as if they had never existed. On the third night, more strange events began. Lights flickered in homes closest to the church. A dog howled relentlessly at shadows that no one else could see. In the cemetery behind the churchyard, fresh soil was found disturbed, though no burials had been scheduled. The caretaker insisted nothing had been touched, but his voice shook as he said it. By the end of the week, fear had settled in the bones of the townsfolk. The local sheriff tried to calm people down, holding a meeting in the old hall near the river. Lanterns cast long, flickering shadows on the walls as neighbors gathered, their voices rising with anger and fear. Some demanded answers about the bell, others accused each other of hiding the truth. The sheriff raised his hand for silence, and when the room finally grew quiet, he told them flatly that there were things in this town better left buried. His words hung in the air like a curse. But the younger ones weren't satisfied. A group of curious residents decided they had to see for themselves what the church was hiding. That night, under a cloudy sky that threatened rain, they crept into the churchyard with flashlights and nervous laughter that faded quickly into silence. The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned as they pushed them open, the stale smell of dust and mildew washing over them. Inside, the pews were covered in sheet. The cold case that still haunts the FBI. In the quiet hours of a foggy November morning, the FBI's field office in Richmond received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end was trembling, rushed, almost desperate to get words out before nerves took over. All they said was, "Check the woods near Meadowbrook Road, it's still there." Then the line went dead. No caller ID, no way to trace the source. Agents were dispatched, unsure if this was another cruel hoax or something far more sinister. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? By late afternoon, a team was combing through a dense patch of forest just outside of a rural neighborhood. The woods stretched for miles, silent except for the crunch of boots on damp leaves. The sky was gray, and the air carried that heavy stillness before nightfall. Just as some of the younger agents began to doubt the tip, one of them noticed something strange beneath a mound of half-frozen earth. A corner of what looked like an old tarp was sticking out. When they pulled it back, what they uncovered would become one of the FBI's most unsettling unsolved cases. The remains inside the tarp were badly decomposed, but clearly human. The body had been bound with rope that had frayed, but still held tight around the wrists and ankles. The jaw was broken, and the skull had a deep fracture that suggested a violent impact. But the most disturbing detail was carved into the wood of a nearby tree. Someone had etched a single word, uneven and jagged, as if done in haste or with shaking hands. The word was mine. From the beginning, the case spiraled into something that investigators could never fully control. Forensic experts determined the body had been there for years, maybe decades, but no missing persons report in the area matched the description. Clothing remnants found with the body seemed outdated, like something from the late 70s or early 80s, but without a label or traceable detail, it was almost impossible to place. Locals who lived near Meadowbrook Road had plenty to say when agents started asking questions. Some remembered strange lights in those woods at night. Others recalled hearing what they described as screams echoing through the trees, always around the same time, just past midnight. A retired hunter swore he once saw a figure crouched near that exact spot long before the discovery, But when he went closer, it vanished into the brush as if it had never been there. The FBI collected every scrap of evidence: soil samples, rope fibers, bone fragments, even the carving on the tree. They brought in behavioral profilers who suggested the killer had likely revisited the site more than once, maybe even for years. The word mine indicated possession, obsession, or perhaps a message meant to terrify anyone who stumbled upon it. And then came the tapes. 2 months into the investigation, a plain envelope arrived at the field office. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was an old VHS tape. Agents set it up in a secure room, half expecting static or some meaningless footage. What they saw instead left even the most seasoned investigators silent. The tape showed a dimly lit basement. A single light bulb swung above, casting shadows that distorted every corner. In the center of the frame was a chair, old and wooden, with rope draped across its arms and legs. The camera zoomed in slowly, and though there was no sound, everyone watching could almost hear the creak of the wood and the hum of the bulb. Then, suddenly, the screen went black. A few seconds later, words appeared, written in block letters across the screen. "She's still waiting." No one could explain how the tape reached the FBI. Lab analysis showed it was recorded on equipment no longer common, perhaps decades old. The handwriting used in the message didn't match any samples in the Bureau's database. Still, the chilling phrase was undeniable. Whoever made it knew about the body in the woods. More envelopes arrived over the following years, each containing a tape or a photograph. One photo showed a stretch of the forest at night, with what looked like a figure standing far in the background, too blurred to identify. Another tape featured the same basement, but this time the chair was overturned and the ropes were scattered across the floor. Again, no sound. And again, a message appeared at the end: "You didn't listen." Agents began to lose sleep over the case. Some requested transfers, unable to shake the feeling that the person behind this was taunting them, watching them. There were whispers in the office about certain files going missing, about evidence being tampered with or moved without authorization. The word haunted wasn't just a metaphor anymore. Investigators felt they were being drawn into something they could never step back from. The case expanded into nearby states, with similar anonymous tips leading to dead ends or strange discoveries. In one abandoned farmhouse in Pennsylvania, agents found a wall covered in newspaper clippings about unsolved murders and disappearances, some dating back 50 years. In the center of the wall, circled in red, was a photo of the Meadowbrook Woods. Psychologists brought in by the Bureau suggested they were dealing with someone meticulous, someone who wanted control over the narrative of fear. The killer, if alive, was still out there. And if dead, his legacy was designed to linger, to keep the FBI chasing shadows indefinitely. But the most disturbing moment came when one of the tapes was played in slow motion. Buried in the background noise of the recording, beneath the static, a faint voice could be heard. The audio team enhanced it, and though it was muffled, the words were unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, whispering over and over, "Please, no more." The Bureau locked those tapes away, sealed in an evidence vault with restricted access. To this day, only a handful of people have seen them. The official files remain classified, but the story still circulates among agents late at night, when the halls of the office are quiet. Some claim the case was cursed from the start. Others believe it was never about solving a murder, but about becoming part of the game the killer designed. Every so often, even now, another envelope appears. No fingerprints, no DNA, no traceable marks. Sometimes it's a photograph of the forest. Sometimes it's a tape that refuses to play, filled with nothing but endless static. But each delivery always arrives with the same phrase scrawled across the package in black ink: "Mine." And that is why, among the countless unsolved cases in FBI archives, this one continues to linger. Not just because of what was found in the woods, but because of the sense that the case isn't truly over. That somewhere out there, the person responsible is still watching, still sending reminders, still pulling strings from the shadows. Even the agents who've retired, long since removed from the case, say they sometimes find things at their doorsteps. A small piece of rope, a torn scrap of tarp, a single photograph of trees in the dark. They know what it means. They don't talk about it publicly, but among themselves, they admit the same thing. This isn't just an unsolved murder. It's a haunting that refuses to fade. A cold case that doesn't just sit in the archives collecting dust, but one that continues to breathe, to follow, to remind. A cold case that still haunts the FBI. When ordinary nights turned into real-life nightmares. The evening had been calm, almost too calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was late autumn, when the days shortened quickly and the cold crept in long before the sun had completely disappeared. The small town of Pine Hollow, tucked between stretches of woodland and winding rivers, was the kind of place where people locked their doors out of habit rather than fear. For years, nothing truly terrible had happened here, and that quiet sense of safety was exactly what made what followed so disturbing. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Thursday night, just past 9, the streets were nearly empty. A few porch lights glowed faintly, and the sound of televisions drifted from living rooms where families settled in after dinner. The air smelled of damp leaves, and a thin mist curled along the edges of the forest that surrounded the town. It was on nights like this that people usually felt comfort in routine, yet beneath that surface calm, something unnatural was already stirring. At the edge of town stood a narrow road that led into the trees, a road most people avoided at night. Locals had stories about headlights flickering there or shadows darting between the trees when no one should have been around. On that particular night, a delivery driver heading home swore he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slowed down, blinking his headlights, but when he drew closer, the figure had vanished. Shaken, he pulled over, convinced for a moment that his mind was playing tricks. But the mist was heavy, and as he sat there listening to the engine idle, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the asphalt. Yet, no one was there. Back in town, around the same time, a group of teenagers was gathered in the old baseball field near the high school. They were laughing, tossing around a football under the dim glow of the single floodlight that still worked. The grass was wet with dew, and the chill forced them to keep moving. One of them paused, looking toward the tree line. A faint, rhythmic knocking sound was coming from the woods. At first, they thought it was an animal. Then, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone rapping wood against wood in a steady beat. They yelled into the darkness, expecting maybe another friend playing a prank, but the sound didn't stop. It moved closer, circling them, until the floodlight above suddenly flickered and went out. The field was swallowed by darkness, and in that instant, all of them ran. Later, when they told their parents, no one believed them. That same night, just after midnight, a young couple living in a small apartment above Main Street awoke to the sound of knocking on their door. At first, they ignored it, thinking it might be someone who had the wrong apartment. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more insistent, louder, and then turned into pounding. The man grabbed a flashlight, went to the door, and called out, but no voice answered. He hesitated before looking through the peephole. What he saw made his stomach twist. There was no one there, yet the pounding continued, echoing through the hallway. Suddenly, the noise stopped, replaced by silence so complete it pressed against his ears. He opened the door cautiously, sweeping the flashlight across the empty hall. The bulb in the overhead light had burned out, and the shadows stretched long. He was about to step back inside when he noticed something smeared across the doorframe. A set of handprints, damp and dark, as though someone had pressed their palms into the wood. By dawn, the town felt different. People were whispering in cafes, parents were checking in on their children, and the sheriff's phone rang nonstop with reports of strange occurrences. Lights flickering in houses, voices heard in empty rooms, shadows appearing at the edge of vision. The sheriff himself, a man hardened by years of quiet service, tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, yet he too had woken in the night to find every clock in his house stopped at exactly 3. 15. The following night, the atmosphere thickened. Streetlights dimmed for no reason, radios filled with static, and dogs across Pine Hollow began to howl in unison. At the small gas station on the corner of Maple Street, the cashier was closing up when he heard what he thought was someone calling his name from the restroom. He checked, but the restroom was empty. When he returned to the counter, every shelf in the store had shifted, cans and bottles rearranged into patterns that looked like circles. He quit his job the very next morning. The town's sense of safety began to erode quickly. Parents kept their children indoors, doors were bolted, and even then, the nights became unbearable. People reported nightmares so vivid they woke up screaming, describing the same thing over and over. A tall shadow, faceless and thin, standing at the foot of their beds, waiting. Some said it whispered their names, others said it only stood in silence. Yet all of them swore it was real. By the third night, the sheriff organized patrols, hoping that extra eyes on the streets would calm everyone down. But even his deputies admitted that strange things were happening. Radios cut out mid-transmission, squad cars stalled without explanation, and two officers swore they saw a figure crawling on all fours across the roof of a house before vanishing into the night. One of the most chilling events happened to a family on Cedar Lane. Just after 2 in the morning, their smoke alarm went off. The parents rushed through the house, searching for fire, but there was no smoke, no flames. Yet, when they entered their daughter's room, they found her standing by the window, wide awake, staring outside. When they asked what she was looking at, she pointed into the yard and said, "He's waiting." The parents looked, but saw nothing. Later, when they checked the yard in daylight, they found a set of footprints in the mud leading up to the window and then disappearing abruptly as though the figure had sunk into the earth. The nightmare spread, no one was spared. People reported hearing cries in the woods, whispers in their homes, and a constant feeling of being watched. Businesses closed early, church services filled with frightened families, and yet no explanation ever came. Scientists were called in from the city, trying to measure electromagnetic fields, looking for gas leaks, anything that might explain the mass hysteria. They left empty-handed, shaken themselves after spending one night in the town. One night, a heavy storm rolled through. Thunder shook the houses, rain hammered the rooftops, and the wind carried voices that seemed to call out from everywhere at once. Entire neighborhoods lost power. In that suffocating darkness, people saw things they would never forget. A woman walking her dog swore she saw dozens of pale hands pressing against the inside of her living room window, even though no one was inside. A truck driver passing through claimed he drove for nearly 20 miles without seeing another car, only to find the same broken-down vehicle appearing again and again on the roadside. By morning, Pine Hollow was not the same town. Ordinary nights had been replaced with nights of terror. People abandoned their homes, some never came back, and others stayed, but lived in constant fear. The sheriff eventually stopped taking reports, not because they stopped happening, but because there were too many. To this day, no one can explain what really descended on Pine Hollow. Some believe it was something ancient, tied to the land itself, awakened by chance. Others whisper it was a punishment, a darkness drawn to the town for reasons no one dares to speak. What remains are the memories, carved into the minds of those who lived through it, reminders that sometimes the most ordinary nights can twist into real-life nightmares, leaving scars that time cannot erase. And if you ever find yourself passing through Pine Hollow on a foggy night, with the streetlights flickering and the woods pressing close, you might feel it too, that sense of being watched. Perhaps you'll hear footsteps following your own, or a faint knock that seems to echo in your bones. And if you do, don't linger too long, because what once came for Pine Hollow may be waiting still, hidden in the mist, ready to turn another ordinary night into something you'll never forget. The school with a disturbing secret. There's an old brick school on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania. a place where the walls seem to hold their breath and the windows watch you as you pass. For decades, it stood in silence, abandoned, its playground rusting away while weeds crawled up the fence line. Locals whispered about it, claiming the school was closed down for reasons no one could quite agree on. Some said it was funding, others said it was structural decay, but underneath those explanations, hidden in the way people's voices dropped when they mentioned it, was the suggestion that the school was hiding something darker. It always began the same way, with an odd stillness whenever someone walked past at night. No traffic, no crickets, no wind against the trees. Just the building looming in silence, as though it had been listening for you all along. Years ago, the town's police chief had to respond to a call about trespassers breaking in, teenagers daring each other to stay overnight. Most of them never made it past the gymnasium before bolting out in a panic, screaming about voices that weren't there. But one time, a group had gone further. They explored the long corridors, their flashlights bouncing against peeling paint and lockers dented from years of use. On the second floor, they found an entire row of classrooms where desks had been overturned and chalkboards were covered in words that didn't belong there. No one admitted to writing them, but the words were carved in deep, jagged scratches. Don't let them out. By the time the chief arrived that night, the kids were hysterical. One of them was missing a shoe, and all of them swore they heard footsteps following them, even though the officers found no sign of anyone else inside. The kids were released to their parents with warnings, but the incident brought back the town's unease. If you ask the older residents, they'll tell you the school shut down after a string of strange events. Students had gone missing. Not all at once, and not in numbers large enough to make national headlines, but one by one, quietly, over the course of a year. A boy vanished after staying late for detention. A girl never came home after drama practice. Each time there were searches, dogs combing the woods, helicopters buzzing overhead, and yet nothing, not a trace. The most disturbing case happened late in autumn, when the days grew shorter and the nights felt heavier. A teacher had stayed late to grade papers, and according to her own testimony, she heard footsteps in the hallway long after everyone else had left. She called out, expecting it to be a student or janitor, but there was no response. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside her classroom door. She pulled it open, but the hallway was empty. Only the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She left in a hurry that night, but when she returned the next morning, something had changed. Her desk had been moved. Not just a little, it had been dragged to the opposite side of the room, scraping deep grooves into the tile. On top of it, her graded papers were stacked neatly, but every page had been torn in half and placed back together in the shape of a cross. From that point on, teachers began requesting transfers. Some quit outright, unable to explain what they had seen or heard. The janitor, a man who had worked there for years, finally resigned after finding something in the basement. He never gave details, but when pressed, he muttered only one sentence before leaving town for good. They shouldn't have dug it up. The basement itself was unusual. Unlike most schools, this one had a sub-basement, a level not listed on any of the building's official blueprints. It was accessed through a heavy metal door at the end of a utility corridor. Teachers claimed it was used for storage, but former staff members later admitted they had never been allowed down there. Only the principal had the key, and when the school was shut down, that door was welded shut. One winter evening, years after its closure, a pair of urban explorers managed to cut their way inside. They filmed their exploration, posting shaky footage online that circulated briefly before being taken down. In the video, you can hear them laughing nervously as they descend the stairs. The deeper they go, the colder the air becomes, their breath visible even with their flashlights trembling. Then the laughter stops. The camera catches walls lined with strange markings, symbols carved into the concrete, some smeared with what looked like dried rust. The explorers whisper about hearing voices. One of them says he feels like someone is breathing on the back of his neck. The video ends abruptly, with the sound of metal slamming shut and their panicked screams. Neither of those men was ever identified, and the footage was dismissed as a hoax by skeptics. But those who saw it said the fear in their voices was real. The town eventually fenced off the property, posting signs that warned trespassers of prosecution, but that never stopped the rumors. Some say at night, if you stand near the chain link fence, you can hear the sound of children reciting lessons in unison, though no one has set foot in those classrooms in decades. Others claim they've seen lights moving across the second floor windows, even though the building has no electricity. One night, a local man walking his dog swore he saw someone standing at the entrance, staring at him. When he shouted, the figure didn't move, only turned its head slightly, as though listening. The man fled, dragging his dog behind him, and when he glanced back, the figure was gone. The police no longer respond to calls about the school. It's considered a nuisance property, a place where legends thrive, but evidence is scarce. Still, the silence surrounding the building is unnerving. Whenever construction crews attempt to tear it down, something happens, a machine malfunctions, a worker is injured, or blueprints go missing. Eventually, contractors refuse to take the job. The school remains untouched, its secrets sealed inside. What makes it all the more chilling is that some residents claim to remember the missing children differently. Ask around long enough, and you'll hear conflicting accounts. Some insist there were 5, others swear it was 7. One elderly man, shaking as he spoke, said there were never missing children at all. That the town invented those stories to cover up what really happened beneath the school. But when pressed on what that was, he refused to continue, muttering that some things are better left buried. Now, the building stands like a scar on the town's landscape. During the day, it's just another ruin, a relic of forgotten times. But at night, when fog rolls in and the streetlights flicker, the school seems alive, waiting. The air grows heavy, and the silence presses in on anyone who dares to linger too long. People hurry past without looking up, afraid they'll catch a glimpse of a face peering out from a window. And though the official record states that the school was closed for budget reasons, the townspeople know better. They may never admit it openly, but deep down, they all feel it. That building is not empty. It's holding something that has been waiting for years, something that should never be let out. The strange death that defied all logic. It was late November in a quiet rural town in Virginia. The air carried the smell of burning wood from fireplaces, the skies darkened early, and long shadows stretched across the empty roads. People were preparing for the winter season, stacking firewood, closing shutters against the cold wind, and settling into their nightly routines. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual until a call came into the sheriff's office just after 10 at night. A man had been found dead inside his own home under circumstances so bizarre that even seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the strangest cases they had ever seen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The house stood on the edge of town, an old 2-story farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Locals often passed by it and commented on its lonely appearance, the way the shutters rattled even when there was no wind, and how the light in the upstairs window sometimes flickered long past midnight. The man who lived there was known by many in town. He was not the type who kept close friends, but he was not disliked either. People described him as polite, quiet, and occasionally eccentric. No one ever expected his name to be tied to one of the most haunting investigations the county would ever face. The discovery was made by a neighbor who noticed that the man's truck had not moved for 2 days, and the porch light had been left on since the weekend. When no one answered repeated knocks on the door, the neighbor called authorities. Deputies arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the cold air as they walked up the creaking porch steps. The front door was locked. Yet when they pushed gently, it gave way with a strange groan, as if it had already been forced from the inside. The scene inside was unsettling from the start. The living room looked untouched, a stack of unopened mail sat neatly on the table, and the fireplace had gone cold. But as the officers moved deeper into the house, they were hit with a wave of unease. The air felt heavy, as if charged with something unseen. Upstairs, the hall was lined with old family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the deputies' every step. They reached the bedroom at the end of the hall, and what they found there was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The man was lying on his bed, but not in the way one might expect. His body was arranged in a rigid, almost ceremonial position, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling in frozen terror. His mouth was twisted into a silent scream, lips cracked as though he had been gasping for air. The blankets beneath him were undisturbed, tucked neatly under his body, suggesting he had not struggled or moved before death. It looked as if he had simply laid down and been struck by an invisible force that drained the life out of him instantly. The strangest detail was the expression on his face. It was not just fear, it was beyond fear. It was as if he had seen something impossible, something no human mind was meant to comprehend. The deputies stood frozen for a moment, their radios crackling softly in the stillness of the house. One of them whispered that it felt like the room itself was colder than the rest of the house, though there was no open window, no draft. When the coroner arrived, he too was baffled. There were no signs of injury, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. His heart had stopped, yet there were no natural causes found on initial inspection. His body temperature was strangely lower than expected, as if he had been dead far longer than he actually had. The coroner would later admit in private that he had never seen a face frozen in such an expression of horror. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to trouble the authorities. The man's phone was found on the nightstand, but its last call had been to 911. The disturbing part was that the call had gone through, yet when dispatch replayed the recording, all that could be heard was static, followed by a faint sound that some described as heavy breathing, while others insisted it sounded like faint whispers in the background. The call had lasted exactly 47 seconds before abruptly ending. Detectives searched the house for clues, but everything seemed in order. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing valuables, no fingerprints other than his own. It was as though death had entered the house unseen and left no trace behind. Some of the younger officers began whispering among themselves about the town's old legends. There had always been rumors that the land the farmhouse sat on carried a history of strange happenings, that years earlier there were stories of people hearing voices at night or feeling watched while walking near the woods behind the property. Most dismissed those tales as folklore, yet now, standing in the dimly lit bedroom, it was harder to ignore. The autopsy brought no clarity. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but with no underlying condition to explain it. His organs were healthy, his blood work was normal, and there were no toxins detected. It was as if his body had simply decided to stop functioning, triggered by something unknown. What haunted those who saw the report was the conclusion written at the bottom. Cause of death undetermined, circumstances highly unusual. Word spread quickly through town, and the farmhouse became the subject of endless speculation. Some insisted he had been frightened to death, that perhaps he had seen something in the moments before he died. Others whispered that the property was cursed, pointing out that decades earlier, another family member had also died under mysterious circumstances in the same house, though few remembered the details. What everyone agreed on was that something about the case felt wrong, as if a piece of the truth was missing, just out of reach. Weeks turned into months, and still no answers came. The house was sealed off, left untouched after the investigation. Neighbors reported strange occurrences in the nights that followed. A woman living across the road claimed she saw a light flickering in the upstairs bedroom, even though the power had been cut. Another swore she heard knocking sounds echoing from inside the house at 3 a.m. The sheriff's office dismissed these as rumors, yet privately, some deputies admitted they avoided driving past the farmhouse after dark. The case eventually went cold, filed away as one of those unsolved mysteries that haunt small towns forever. The official records would state that the man died of cardiac arrest, but everyone who had been there that night knew there was more to the story. They remembered the expression on his face, the static-filled 911 call, the cold air that seemed to linger in the bedroom long after the body was taken away. Years later, the house still stands. The paint has peeled, the porch is collapsing, and weeds have overtaken the yard. But at night, if you pass by on the empty road and glance toward the upstairs window, some say you can still see a faint figure lying on the bed, staring upward with eyes wide open, locked forever in that same unexplainable terror. The strange death that defied all logic has never been forgotten. It remains a story told in hushed tones at diners and around campfires, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling horror is not what can be explained, but what cannot. And in that quiet Virginia town, the farmhouse continues to cast its long shadow, holding on to secrets that no one has been able to uncover.